Hello again, and welcome back to Authoritarianism 101. My name is Aengus Song, and this is the second of a series of video presentations introducing the subject of authoritarian political ideology. In the earlier of these presentations, we began a discussion about why it's important to study authoritarian political ideas. We noted that some authoritarian ideas could lead us toward destructive conclusions about politics without actually being political themselves. And so it was important to be able to recognize these ideas so that we could avoid embracing them inadvertently. But what are the ideas that authoritarian intellectual manipulators wish us to embrace? And why do they wish us to embrace these particular ideas? These questions lead us to consider how authoritarian ideas work in a practical sense, as instruments of intellectual and political subjugation. The ultimate purpose of authoritarian ideologies, of course, is to establish and perpetuate the power of authoritarian states. The principal way that these ideas do this is by convincing great masses of people to voluntarily submit themselves to these states' power. Authoritarian ideas do this not so much as we might think, by frightening us or by offering us incentives, but rather by making us believe that morality, political morality, requires us to accede to authoritarian imperatives and directives. Because most people want to think themselves moral, most people will try to do what an authoritarian state demands, if they believe that is what is moral. And disturbingly, history suggests that the majority of people are capable of committing the most grievous political evils, if they believe that doing so is morally justified or morally necessary. But how exactly do authoritarian intellectual manipulators convince people that doing the bidding of authoritarian states is moral, so that they will willingly submit themselves to the authority of such a state? If we can understand this, we may better be able to protect ourselves against being manipulated, because we will better be able to anticipate the intellectual tricks that the manipulators intend to play on us. The most important trick that authoritarian intellectual manipulators use against people is that of placing them in a sort of artificial intellectual environment, or alternative intellectual universe, so to speak. Kind of like the one depicted in that movie starring Keanu Reeves, The Matrix. This tactic postulates imaginary sets of circumstances, or false realities, that turn political morality on its head, confusing us about what is just or unjust, rightful or a violation of people's rights. We discussed one of these false realities in the first of these presentations, the one entitled Why It's Important to Study Authoritarian Political Ideologies, when we considered how the category of doctrines known generically as theism could be used to make fraudulent claims on people, property, and political authority. Theologies, or religions, by the way, are the oldest sorts of these intellectual matrices, or artificial realities. Now, theories about the broad and general nature of reality are the province of that branch of philosophy that is known technically as metaphysics. So when we begin to examine such theories, including those theories promulgated by authoritarian philosophers, it is metaphysical philosophy that we are discussing. There are three basic theories of reality advanced by authoritarian metaphysicians. But before we begin our examination of these, let us note again, as we did before, that while these are the theories that political authoritarians use to provide the premises for their moral arguments, not all of the philosophers who have advocated these metaphysical theories can definitively be identified as political authoritarians. That said, the three basic types of metaphysical dogmas that authoritarians propound to ground their moral theories are technically denoted Idealism, Materialism, and Heracliteanism, after the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus of Ephesus. Each of these credos presents a distorted view of reality that turns morality on its head and tricks us into confusing good with evil and evil with good. Let's take a quick look at each of these doctrines and briefly consider how they confuse us about morality, and then go a little further and consider how authoritarian intellectuals prepare us to accept these theories despite their bearing little resemblance to the universe that we actually inhabit. The metaphysical doctrine known as idealism has already been introduced in the earlier video. But to refresh your memory, or if you haven't yet reviewed that video, this doctrine says that reality is created by some mind or minds and is essentially spiritual in nature, like a thought, rather than material. This idea, we earlier noted, insinuates the existence of some immensely powerful being, such as the gods of religion, who plausibly possesses a right of ownership and control over everything in reality because this being, God, has created reality. We saw that the political implication of this idea is that humanity collectively and individuals personally have no right to control human politics or even to control their own lives and property, because, given such a supposition, only the great creator of these values, God, could reasonably and justly claim such a right. We noted that, historically, this idea has been employed to legitimize that form of authoritarian statism that is known as theocracy, by asserting that certain human beings, appointed by God to represent his interests on earth, had a right to rule the human race as God's divinely appointed property managers or stewards. This idea is, indeed, one of the primary sources of that concept of political authority that is known as the divine right of kings. Now, in contradistinction to the metaphysical doctrine of idealism is the metaphysical doctrine of materialism. This doctrine says that everything in the universe is material or physical rather than spiritual in nature, and that all events in the universe are governed by the cause and effect mechanics that determine the actions of physical matter. But this idea isn't really what authoritarian metaphysicians mean when they use the word materialism. What they mean is that human beings, in the manner of raw matter, are mechanical, and mechanical in a negative, deleterious sort of way, that is, mechanically immoral, or mechanically irrational, or mechanically ineffectual. This deterministic and pessimistic interpretation of human nature serves authoritarian purposes by leading us toward the conclusion that human beings are congenitally unfit to live in a free society, because their very nature disqualifies them from being free. When you hear the word materialism used to refer to metaphysical concepts today, it is almost always this deterministic, pessimistic conception, applied narrowly to human beings, that is being alluded to. And finally, among the panoply of metaphysical doctrines employed by authoritarian ideologues, there is Heracliteanism, a doctrine that actually contradicts both of the other metaphysical creeds that provide premises for authoritarian concepts of political morality. The ancient Greek philosopher this doctrine is named after, Heraclitus, had said that everything in reality is constantly and chaotically changing, so that reality has no consistent nature at all, neither material nor spiritual, nor anything else. This idea can be used to advance authoritarian political interests by providing grounds for the idea that the principles that free societies are founded upon are invalid, because the theories of nature and human nature that provide their premises cannot be demonstrated to be true, and indeed can't be true, since there are no truths in a universe where nothing has any particular nature. It further implies that with no means of arriving at commonly shared truths, because there can be no truths in a Heraclitean universe, that human beings have no way of resolving their conflicts other than that of brute force. So the dog-eat-dog rule of tooth and claw that characterizes authoritarian politics becomes thereby logically and morally legitimized. This doctrine also serves authoritarian interests by suggesting that none of the productive enterprises that people engage in order to peaceably sustain themselves will bear fruit, since in a world where nothing has any stable identity, no productive cause, such as cultivating land to produce a crop, will have any predictable or profitable effect. This idea subverts a free society by suggesting that one cannot earn a living by means of nonviolent productivity, so engaging in the systematic violence that characterizes authoritarian politics becomes not only justifiable, but existentially necessary. Now, the problem with all of these metaphysical hypotheses is that they in fact bear no resemblance to the actual features of the reality that we live in, and so constitute logically shaky grounds upon which to establish the moral justifications for the existence of authoritarian states. There is no evidence, after all, that reality is created by some mind, such as that of a god, or that it is spiritual rather than material in nature. And despite humanity's demonstrable capacity for wickedness, irrationality, and inefficacy, there is no credible evidence that shows that these fallibilities are innate, reductive, mechanistic features of human nature, as the modern metaphysical materialists aver. And even though we do live in a world where things are constantly changing, the preponderance of evidence shows that these changes obey the constant laws of nature discovered by science, not the willy-nilly tyranny of chaos proposed by Heraclitus. So how are authoritarian metaphysicians going to get us to accept these theories so that they can get us to accept the dogmas of political morality that are based upon them? Well, historically, they've employed a different kind of philosophical theory, epistemological theories, to trick us into accepting their metaphysical conceptions of reality. Epistemology, technically, is the branch of philosophy that considers the nature and status of knowledge, and that advises us about which methods of acquiring knowledge are reliable and which are not. Valid philosophies of knowledge can help us attain an authentic understanding of reality, but there are philosophies of epistemology that can lead us into ignorance and keep us there. Authoritarian epistemologists have used these latter methods to keep people in a state of ignorance about the actual facts of the world they live in, and to get them to believe in worlds that do not, in fact, exist. The epistemological philosophies that authoritarian dogmatists promulgate can roughly be categorized under two headings, those of skepticism and those of faith. We should note again, though, before we go further, that, as with philosophies of metaphysics, the fact that a particular philosopher or theologian displays an affinity for one of these epistemological methodologies does not necessarily mean that philosopher is a political authoritarian. This caveat aside, skepticism, as an epistemological philosophy, is a body of arguments that assert that human faculties of knowledge, especially our sense faculties, such as our eyes and ears and other senses, are unreliable, or even just plain useless, as a means of acquiring knowledge, a doctrine that leads to the conclusion that human beings can never really be sure that they know anything at all about the perceivable world around them. Epistemologies of faith, on the other hand, say that anything and everything may be known, simply by making reference to the contents of one's own inner states of consciousness, without referring to the empirical facts of reality apprehended by our senses. As one unimpeachable authority on faith, the Apostle Paul, famously wrote in his letter to the Hebrews, quote, "Faith is being sure of what we hope for, and certain of what we do not see." The reason that authoritarian epistemologists want us to feel sure of what is hoped for, without reference to the facts of reality that can actually be seen, is that authoritarian realities can only be confirmed by looking within ourselves, for there is nothing in the outside world that otherwise confirms them. The reason that these epistemologists want us to be skeptical of our senses, on the other hand, and skeptical also of methods of reasoning that are based upon sense perception, such as inductive logic, is that our sensory facilities reveal the factual baselessness of authoritarian dogmas, and conversely affirm the truth of the principles upon which free or liberal societies are established. The intellectual victims of the epistemologies of faith and skepticism are rendered mentally helpless by them, because the method of gathering knowledge they've been trained to trust is unreliable, while the faculties they desperately need to discover what is real, they doubt. Once under the spell of faith and skepticism, the victims of authoritarian epistemological manipulation can readily be herded into a state of ideological bondage that makes escape from political bondage all but impossible. And so, if we wish to avoid being ideologically subjugated and politically enslaved, and to continue living in a free society, we must fight to maintain our epistemological rationality, our grip on metaphysical reality, and the grasp of moral truth that these make possible. This is accomplished, in large part, by working to familiarize ourselves with the philosophical tactics of authoritarian ideological manipulators, and by learning to recognize these tactics generically rather than merely in terms of their specific manifestations. For one of the principal ploys of this tradition of intellectual manipulation is that of incessantly inventing new ways of giving expression to the same basic ideas, and of constantly changing the name of these ideas, so that as soon as people learn to recognize and protect themselves against one expression of authoritarian dogma, they are confronted by another that they do not recognize, and so are defenseless against. To assist toward these ends, I've begun producing and releasing these video presentations. But for those of you who wish to more immediately avail yourselves of an understanding of these ideas, I've also published a textual study of this subject entitled Flowers from the Garden of Evil, Everyone's Guide to the Elements of Authoritarian Dogma. This written resource introduces the generic logic of authoritarian arguments, and then shows how this logic has manifested itself in the many superficially distinct but fundamentally similar ways in which it appears, both left-wing and right-wing, secular and religious. Available through Amazon Books, the ebook edition of this study costs no more than one of the less expensive items at McDonald's, and a print version with an extensive index is also available through Amazon, for those of you who prefer to actually hold the book in your hands. So congratulations on taking up the fight to protect yourself against the tactics of intellectual manipulation that have facilitated institutionalized political evil for thousands of years. By doing so, you deprive the manipulators of one more mind, in this case your own, that they might otherwise control.